The snowman's head hit the ground with a dull thud, crumbling into pieces across the pristine white lawn. Patricia Winters stood over it, clipboard in hand, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. Behind her, 8-year-old Ethan Parker watched in horror, his mittened hands covering his mouth to stifle a sob. Temporary structures require prior written approval from the Homeowners Association, Patricia announced, making a show of checking something off her list. Section 7, Paragraph 4 of the Sunny Pines Community Guidelines. The deadline for winter decoration applications was November 15th. A window slid open from the house next door. "Are you serious right now, Patricia?" Sarah Chen called out, her voice sharp in the cold December air. "It's a child's snowman, for God's sake." Patricia turned, her highlighted blonde bob swinging perfectly at her shoulders despite the winter wind. At 53, she maintained the polished appearance of someone who considered neighborhood aesthetics a personal responsibility. Her red wool coat, carefully chosen to complement the holiday season while remaining tastefully understated, was buttoned precisely to the second from top button. "Rules exist for a reason, Sarah," Patricia replied coolly. "If we make exceptions, soon everyone will think guidelines are merely suggestions." Ethan's father, Mark, stepped outside, quickly assessing the situation. He knelt beside his son, putting a comforting arm around the boy's shoulders. "Miss Winters," Mark began, his voice controlled but tight with anger, "did you just destroy my son's snowman?" Patricia checked her watch, a delicate silver timepiece that matched her earrings. "I documented the violation and taken appropriate corrective action. You're welcome to appeal at next month's HOA meeting." Across the street, cameras appeared in windows. Patricia noticed but didn't flinch. She'd grown accustomed to being recorded. As HOA president for the past 5 years, she developed a thick skin and unwavering commitment to property values. Sunny Pines hadn't won Most Desirable Community 3 years running by allowing random snow sculptures to disrupt neighborhood cohesion. "You've got to be kidding me," Mark said, standing to his full height. "It's a snowman. It would have melted in a few days." "Then filing for temporary approval shouldn't have been too burdensome," Patricia countered. She tucked her clipboard under her arm and adjusted her leather gloves. "I've included the proper forms in your mailbox, for future reference." As she walked away, Patricia heard Sarah mutter "absolute psychopath" loud enough to carry. She smiled tightly but didn't turn around. Let them think what they wanted. Property values in Sunny Pines had increased 12% under her leadership, while neighboring communities struggled with declining assessments. Back in her immaculate kitchen, Patricia hung her coat in the precisely allocated space in her mudroom and checked her schedule. 3 more violation notices to deliver, then the holiday lights inspection beginning at 4 p.m. The committee was counting on her to ensure all exterior illumination fell within the approved color temperature range of 2700–3000 K. No blue-white LEDs permitted this year after last December's Winter Wonderland disaster at the Rodriguez home. Patricia poured herself exactly 6 ounces of Pinot Grigio. She glanced out of her window at the Parker home, where Mark was already building another snowman with Ethan. She sighed, picking up her phone. This would require an email to the full board. Patricia typed furiously, her French manicured nails clicking against her keyboard. Emergency notice. Unauthorized snow structures. She copied all 147 homeowners, making sure to BCC the township zoning officer she'd been cultivating a relationship with. The email detailed the Parker violation with timestamps and reference codes, attaching the relevant bylaw sections highlighted in yellow. Her doorbell rang just as she hit send. Through her security camera, Patricia spotted Mark Parker on her doorstep, shifting from foot to foot in the cold. She straightened her cashmere sweater and practiced her neutral expression before opening the door exactly 3 inches, the security chain still engaged. "Mr. Parker, this is unexpected." "Look, Patricia," Mark said, exhaling a cloud of vapor into the frigid air. "I understand rules are important, but don't you think this is excessive?" Ethan cried for 20 minutes. Patricia's expression remained impassive, though she noted with disapproval the snow melting from Mark's boots onto her welcome mat. Children need to learn that actions have consequences. In this case, the consequence of not filing proper documentation. "He's 8 years old. Old enough to learn about civic responsibility," Patricia replied. "My daughter Clarissa was submitting properly formatted requests to paint her bedroom by age 7. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "That explains a lot," he muttered. Then louder. "Here's the thing. I've looked through the bylaws. There's nothing specifically prohibiting snow sculptures in the temporary structures clause." Patricia's eyes narrowed. An amateur trying to interpret HOA regulations was like a child attempting surgery. Section 7, paragraph. Paragraph 4 specifically mentions constructed items requiring permits. Mark interrupted, pulling out his phone to display the document. "Snow isn't constructed, it's formed. It's naturally occurring precipitation shaped by hand. No construction materials were used. Patricia felt her pulse quicken. A technicality. She despised technicalities when they weren't working in her favor. The interpretation of bylaws falls to the board and Mr. Parker, not individual homeowners. Then call an emergency meeting, Mark challenged, because I've already sent an email to everyone pointing out this distinction. Patricia's phone buzzed in her pocket, multiple notifications. She maintained her composure despite the rising heat in her cheeks. Very well. I'll consult with the board, but be aware that this type of confrontational approach rarely ends well for homeowners. After closing the door, Patricia checked her messages. 17 responses already, most supporting the Parkers. Even board member Dave Thompson, usually a reliable ally, had replied, all asking if this was really the hill we want to die on. Patricia called an emergency Zoom meeting for 7 p.m. This insurrection needed to be quelled immediately. She spent the next hour preparing her presentation, including property value charts and photos of other neighborhoods that had let standards slip. Her color-coded slides included historical precedent for maintaining strict interpretations of ambiguous bylaw language. At 6:55, she logged into Zoom expecting the usual smattering of attendees. Instead, she found 63 participants waiting, almost half the neighborhood. Names she hadn't seen at meetings in years. The chat was already active. Board Treasurer Elaine Murphy's message flashed, "Patricia, check your email. Something's happened." Patricia opened her inbox to find a community-wide message from Sarah Chen with a video attachment. The subject line read, "How our HOA president treats children in our community." The thumbnail showed Patricia knocking over Ethan's Snowman while the child watched. The meeting was about to begin, and her carefully constructed presentation suddenly felt woefully inadequate. For the first time in her HOA presidency, Patricia Winters felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The Zoom meeting was a disaster. Patricia tried to maintain order, repeatedly citing Robert's rules, but the chat function exploded with comments faster than she could address them. Board member Dave Thompson suggested tabling the snow structure issue until the January meeting, but Patricia refused to cede control of the agenda. "This is precisely why we need consistent enforcement," she insisted, sharing her screen to display the first of her 17 prepared slides. "Once we allow exceptions based on emotional appeals rather than consistent application of the bylaws." "Patricia," interrupted Elaine Murphy, "the treasurer, 68 people have joined this call. That's a record. Maybe we should hear what the community has to say." The ensuing 40 minutes were excruciating. One by one, homeowners recounted their experiences with Patricia's reign of terror. Michael Abernathy described receiving a violation notice for garbage cans visible from the street when he'd been hospitalized for 3 days. The Rodriguez family detailed last year's holiday-like controversy, which ended with Patricia measuring the lumens from their nativity scene with a professional light meter. "What bothers me most," said elderly Mrs. Takahashi, who rarely spoke at meetings, "is the selective enforcement. Patricia's rose bushes extend 6 inches beyond her property line onto the common area, yet she cited me for a birdhouse that was allegedly 2 inches too tall." Patricia felt her face burning. "That's simply untrue. My landscaping is meticulously maintained within boundary lines." Sarah Chen unmuted herself. "I have measurements and photos that suggest otherwise. I'd be happy to share them with the board." Patricia recognized the dangerous territory she was entering. She'd made strategic exceptions for herself over the years, a slightly oversized mailbox post, the unapproved pergola in her backyard that she'd classified as a temporary shade structure for 5 consecutive summers. Nothing major, but enough to appear hypocritical if scrutinized. "We're getting off topic," Patricia said firmly. "The issue at hand is the unauthorized snow sculpture at the Parker residence." "Actually," Dave interjected, "I move that we create a bylaw review committee to examine inconsistencies in selective enforcement." "All in favor?" A cascade of A votes flooded the chat. "Second," called several voices simultaneously. Patricia struggled to regain control. "This isn't the proper procedure for." "I further move," continued Dave, "that we suspend all violation notices until this committee completes its review." "All in favor?" More affirmative votes poured in. "This is irregular and potentially damaging to our community standards," Patricia protested, but her voice was drowned out by continued discussion. By meeting's end, not only had the board voted to rescind the Snowman violation, but they'd established a 3-person committee to review all bylaws, with Mark Parker appointed as chair. Patricia's agenda had been completely derailed, and her carefully constructed presentation remained unviewed past the first slide. After logging off, Patricia sat in stunned silence at her kitchen island. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Clarissa. "Mom, you're all over the neighborhood Facebook group. What happened?" Patricia navigated to the Sunny Pines community page she typically avoided due to its unmoderated chaos. The top post was Sarah's video, now with over 200 comments. Worse, someone had created a meme of Patricia's face superimposed over the Grinch with the caption, HOA Karen. Even Snowman need permits. She closed the app and poured another glass of wine, this time not bothering to measure the ounces. 20 years in this community, 5 as HOA president, all of her work maintaining standards and property values. And this was her reward. Being mocked because she enforced the very rules everyone had agreed to in purchasing their homes. Her doorbell rang again. This time, her security camera showed Board Vice President Richard Willis on her porch, his expression grave. "We need to talk," Richard Willis said as Patricia reluctantly opened her door. The vice president's weathered face looked even more lined than usual beneath his salt and pepper hair. "This isn't a good time, Richard," Patricia replied, but stepped aside to let him in anyway. She'd known Richard for 15 years. He'd been the one who recruited her for the board initially. Richard settled on her immaculate white sofa, declining her perfunctory offer of tea. "Patricia, I've always respected your dedication to this community, but this situation has spiraled out of control." "It's a temporary setback," Patricia insisted, perching on the edge of her armchair. "People are emotional about children. Once they've had time to reflect on the precedent this sets." "It's more than that," Richard interrupted. "The board has been getting complaints about your approach for months. We've tried to handle them discreetly, but this Snowman incident has brought everything to a head." Patricia felt a cold sensation spreading through her chest. "What are you saying?" "We're calling for an emergency election for the position of HOA president. The bylaws allow it with support from 2/3 of the board." Richard looked uncomfortable but determined. "We have the votes, Patricia." "This is absurd," she snapped. "Because of a snowman? Because I enforce the rules as written?" "Because you've lost the community's trust," Richard replied quietly. "This isn't just about rules, it's about judgment and discretion. About knowing when enforcement serves the community and when it becomes harmful." Patricia stood abruptly. "I've dedicated years to maintaining this neighborhood's standards. Our property values are the highest in the county because of my diligence." "No one's questioning your dedication," Richard said, rising as well. "But leadership requires more than just enforcement. The election will be held next Tuesday. You're welcome to make your case to the community, of course." After he left, Patricia paced her living room, fury and disbelief warring within her. An election? After everything she'd sacrificed, the endless hours cataloging violations, the meticulous documentation, the confrontations with contractors who tried to cut corners, she'd been protecting everyone's investments while they complained about following simple rules. Her phone chimed with an email notification. The board had already sent out the election announcement, naming the candidates, Patricia Winters, and her stomach dropped to her chin. The email included links to submit questions for the candidates and a detailed explanation of voting procedures. Patricia opened her laptop and began typing furiously, creating a presentation documenting the increase in property values during her tenure. She pulled up comparison photos of nearby communities that had let standards slip, showing unkempt lawns and mismatched fencing. She would make them see reason. As she worked, Patricia heard laughter outside. Through her front window, she saw a group of children rolling massive snowballs across the Parkers' yard. More snowmen were appearing. One child, the Rodriguez boy, she thought was even constructing what appeared to be a snow fort. Her phone rang. It was her daughter, Clarissa, calling from her apartment in the city. "Mom, are you okay? I've been texting you." "I'm fine," Patricia replied automatically. "Just busy preparing for an important presentation." "Mom, I saw the video," Clarissa said quietly. "Why would you knock down a little kid's snowman?" Patricia felt a surge of betrayal. "Not you too. You know how important rules are, Clarissa. I taught you that structure and consistency are what make communities function." There was a long pause on the line. "You know what I remember most about growing up in that house, Mom? The time you made me take down my handmade birthday decorations because they didn't meet aesthetic standards. I was 9. Patricia stared out the window at the children playing freely in the snow, building whatever their imaginations desired. For the first time, a small, unwelcome doubt crept into her mind. Patricia barely slept that night. Clarissa's words echoed in her mind, stirring memories she'd long suppressed. The carefully organized birthday party where her daughter's homemade streamers and signs were deemed visually inconsistent. The Halloween when she made Clarissa change costumes because the purple witch outfit clashed with her home's exterior color palette. The teenage years filled with rigid curfews and inspections of Clarissa's room for organizational compliance. By morning, Patricia had convinced herself these recollections were exaggerated. Structure had prepared Clarissa for success. She was now a meticulous accountant with an immaculate apartment. Patricia had done right by her daughter, just as she was doing right by Sunny Pines. She dressed with particular care in a navy suit that projected authority and composure. Today, she would begin her campaign to retain her position. She printed flyers detailing her accomplishments as HOA president and planned to distribute them personally, an opportunity to remind neighbors of her dedication. Patricia was arranging the flyers in her leather portfolio when her doorbell rang again. This time it was Dave Thompson, looking uncomfortable in his weekend casual attire. "Dave, I wasn't expecting you," she said, inviting him in with reluctance. As board secretary, Dave had been the first to betray her yesterday with his motion to create the review committee. "Patricia, I come as a friend," he said, declining to sit. "There's something you need to see before you go out today." He handed her his tablet, open to the community forum. A new post from last night had hundreds of comments. Someone had created a dedicated website, Stunny Pines HOA Watch. The landing page featured a photo of Patricia mid Snowman destruction, alongside a compilation of violation notices issued over her tenure. "They've been uploading their violation notices all night," Dave explained. "There's a map showing every citation you've issued in the past 5 years, color-coded by severity. They're claiming you've issued 3 times more violations to households with children or minorities." "That's preposterous," Patricia snapped. "I enforce the rules equally." "The data suggests patterns, Patricia. The Rodriguez family has received 12 violations in 2 years. The Goldsteins, 11. Meanwhile, Richard Willis hasn't received any, despite his fence clearly exceeding height restrictions." Patricia's mouth went dry. She'd overlooked Richard's fence because he'd supported her appointment to the board. It had seemed like a reasonable courtesy at the time. "This witch hunt is based on distorted statistics," she insisted, though a knot was forming in her stomach. Dave sighed. "There's more. They created templates for filing formal complaints with the county about selective enforcement based on discriminatory practices." "That's completely unfounded," Patricia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd never considered her enforcement discriminatory. She'd simply been more thorough with households that had previously violated rules. If those happened to include more families with children or diverse backgrounds, that was coincidental, wasn't it? "I'm telling you as someone who respects what you tried to do for this community," Dave said gently. "But if these complaints escalate to the county level, it won't just be your HOA presidency at stake. There could be legal ramifications, Patricia." After Dave left, Patricia sat at her kitchen island with the untouched flyers mocking her. Outside, more children had gathered at the Parker house, and what appeared to be an entire snow village was taking shape. Parents stood chatting, cups of what she assumed was hot chocolate in hand. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elaine Murphy. "Have you seen the forum? We need to discuss damage control." Patricia set her phone down without responding. For the first time in 5 years, she had no clear violation to cite, no bylaw to reference, no immediate solution. The neat, orderly world she worked so hard to maintain was suddenly messy with human emotions and complex social dynamics that couldn't be contained in a spreadsheet or citation form. She found herself staring at a framed photo on her wall, her ex-husband James with Clarissa at graduation. He'd always said Patricia couldn't see the forest for the trees. Not everything that matters can be measured and regulated, Patty told her before he left 8 years ago. Patricia reached for her portfolio of flyers, then hesitated, her hand hovering over the carefully crafted defense of her leadership. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed Clarissa's number. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I'm busy right now," Clarissa said when she answered. Her voice was cool, professional, the tone she used with difficult clients. "I just wanted to talk," Patricia said, suddenly unsure what she planned to say. "About the Snowman? Or about how the entire neighborhood seems to be revolting against you?" Clarissa sighed. "I warned you this would happen eventually." Patricia blinked. "You did?" "Every time I visited, Mom. Every time you complained about the Rodriguezes or the Parkers or whoever had offended your sensibilities that week, I told you that communities are built on relationships, not just rules." Patricia felt defensive heat rising in her cheeks. "I was protecting everyone's investments. Someone has to maintain standards. And it never occurred to you that you could enforce rules with kindness, that you could build consensus instead of ruling by fear? Dad tried to tell you that too." The mention of her ex-husband stung. James had been the gregarious one, hosting neighborhood barbecues and organizing block parties, events Patricia had tolerated as community engagement initiatives, but secretly found chaotic and inefficient. "I need your help," Patricia admitted, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "The election is Tuesday and You want campaign advice?" Clarissa laughed, a short, humorless sound. "From the daughter you criticized for hanging posters in her bedroom with the wrong kind of adhesive." "I don't know what to do," Patricia said quietly. The line went silent for a moment. "That might be the first time I've ever heard you say those words," Clarissa finally replied. "Look, Mom, I can't help you win an election to continue being the neighborhood tyrant. But if you genuinely want to change your approach, that's different." "I just want to preserve what I've built," Patricia insisted. "What exactly have you built, Mom? High property values? Or a community where people feel controlled and resentful, where children can't even build snowmen without permission? The question hung in the air between them. Patricia thought of the neighbors gathering at the Parkers' house, sharing hot chocolate and laughter, something that had never happened on her lawn. "I need to go," Clarissa said. "But Mom, if you really want things to change, you might start by apologizing to that little boy." After hanging up, Patricia stood at her window, watching the growing snow village. More families had joined, bringing sleds and thermoses. Someone had set up a portable fire pit where adults gathered while children played. The scene looked joyful. When was the last time she felt joy in this neighborhood she worked so hard to perfect? Almost without conscious decision, Patricia found herself putting on her coat and boots. She walked across the street, aware of conversations stopping as neighbors noticed her approach. She recognized the wariness in their expressions, the same look her daughter had worn as a teenager when Patricia entered her room for an inspection. Mark Parker was helping several children construct what appeared to be a snow castle complete with a moat. He straightened when he saw her, his stance protective. "Mr. Parker," Patricia began, her rehearsed speech deserting her. If you're here to issue more violations, save your breath," he said, his voice low enough that the children couldn't hear. "Actually, I came to speak with Ethan," she said, "if that's acceptable." Mark looked surprised, then wary. "Why?" A valid question. Why was she here? What did she hope to accomplish? Patricia had never been good at improvising. Her life ran on careful plans and procedures. "I believe I owe him an apology," she said finally. Mark studied her face for a long moment, then called to his son. Ethan approached cautiously, half hiding behind his father's leg. Patricia knelt down, snow immediately soaking through her designer pants. "Ethan, I'm sorry I destroyed your snowman yesterday. It was wrong of me." The words felt strange. Patricia Winters didn't apologize, but as they left her mouth, something tight in her chest loosened slightly. Ethan peered at her with solemn brown eyes. "My dad says you were just doing your job." "Your dad is kind to say that," Patricia replied, glancing up at Mark's surprised expression. "But sometimes doing your job the wrong way isn't something to be proud of." Ethan considered this. "Do you want to help us build the snow castle? You can do the towers. They're hard." Patricia stared at Ethan, momentarily speechless. When was the last time anyone had invited her to join an activity? Not a committee or a board or a task force, but simply to play. "I'm not sure I'd be very good at building snow castles," she admitted. "That's okay," Ethan said with a child's easy acceptance. "Dad says nobody's good at everything." Mark seemed as surprised by his son's invitation as Patricia was. After a moment's hesitation, he offered, "There's hot chocolate, if you're interested." Against every instinct developed over decades of maintaining careful boundaries, Patricia found herself nodding. "I'd like that. Thank you." What followed was the strangest afternoon of Patricia's recent life. She awkwardly attempted to pack snow into tower shapes, while neighborhood children she normally knew only as violation at 247 Maple or non-compliant basketball hoop on Elm gave her earnest instructions. Parents who had been avoiding eye contact with her for years cautiously offered pleasantries, their surprise at her presence evident but largely unspoken. Sarah Chen approached, 2 steaming cups in hand. "Hot chocolate," she said, offering one to Patricia. "I'm not sure how you take it." "Thank you," Patricia replied, accepting the cup. The steam warmed her face as she inhaled the sweet scent. "Sarah, about the video." "I probably shouldn't have posted it without talking to you first," Sarah admitted. "But seeing Ethan's face when you knocked down his snowman, it hit a nerve." Patricia nodded. "I understand. And you were right to call me out." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "That's not what I expected you to say." "It's been a day of unexpected realizations," Patricia replied, watching as Ethan directed the construction of a snow drawbridge. "I've been so focused on protecting property values that I lost sight of why those values matter, so people can have homes in a community worth living in." A small smile touched Sarah's lips. "That's surprisingly insightful, Patricia." "Don't sound so shocked," Patricia said dryly, but found herself returning the smile. "I'm capable of growth, apparently." As the afternoon progressed, Patricia was drawn into conversations she would have previously avoided as inefficient. She learned that Michael Abernathy's hospitalization had been for heart problems, that Mrs. Takahashi's birdhouse was built with her late husband before he passed, that the Rodriguez family's elaborate Christmas display was a tradition carried from their hometown in Mexico. These weren't just rule breakers, they were people with stories and reasons and emotional attachments to things Patricia had dismissed as violations. As the winter sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, parents started calling children home for dinner. Patricia helped gather abandoned sleds and mittens, feeling oddly reluctant for the day to end. You surprise everyone today, Mark said as they watched Ethan put the finishing touches on the Snow King for the castle, including me. I surprised myself, Patricia admitted. Though I doubt one afternoon erases 5 years of being the neighborhood villain. Mark considered this. Maybe not, but it's a start. He hesitated. The election is still happening Tuesday. Sarah would make a good president, you know. Yes, Patricia said, surprising herself again. I think she would. Walking home, Patricia noticed details she'd overlooked during her usual violation hunting patrols. The way the Goldsteins' wind chimes created a gentle melody in the evening breeze. The charming, if technically non-regulation, mosaic mailbox posts at the corner house. The warm glow of varied porch lights illuminating family dinner tables inside. Her phone buzzed with texts from board members still strategizing damage control. It buzzed again with a message from Clarissa. Did you talk to the boy? Patricia typed back, yes, and I helped build a snow castle. The reply came quickly. Who are you and what have you done with my mother? For the first time in longer than she could remember, Patricia Winters laughed out loud, her breath clouding in the cold air as she stood alone on her immaculate front walk. Tuesday evening arrived faster than Patricia had anticipated. She sat in the back row of the community center as neighbors filed in for the emergency election, nodding politely when people noticed her. The room filled quickly, another record turnout with folding chairs added to accommodate the crowd. Richard Willis called the meeting to order, explaining the voting procedures. Patricia had declined to make a formal speech, a decision that had clearly surprised the board. Sarah Chen, the only other candidate, spoke briefly about fostering community engagement and balancing property standards with neighborly consideration. As paper ballots were distributed, Patricia found herself oddly calm. The frantic energy that had driven her for years, the constant vigilance against community decay, the meticulous documentation of every infraction, had subsided to a quiet hum. She'd spent the past 2 days at home, sorting through her extensive files of violation notices and community guidelines. Before we proceed with the vote, Richard announced, Patricia Winters has requested a moment to address the community. A murmur swept through the room as Patricia made her way to the front. She carried no notes or presentation materials, another departure from her usual meticulously prepared approach. Thank you for coming tonight, she began, surveying the faces watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to lingering hostility. I served as your HOA president for 5 years with what I believe was the community's best interest at heart. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I've recently come to understand that my interpretation of best interests was unnecessarily narrow. I focused on property values and aesthetic uniformity at the expense of what makes a neighborhood truly valuable, the people who live here and the connections between them. Patricia noticed Mark Parker in the third row, nodding slightly. Beside him, Ethan was drawing on the back of a ballot form. I spent the past 2 days reviewing every violation notice I've issued. I found patterns I'm not proud of, inconsistencies in enforcement, rigidity where flexibility would have served better, and moments where compassion should have outweighed compliance. She straightened her shoulders. I'm withdrawing my candidacy for HOA president. Instead, I'd like to offer my organizational skills to the bylaw review committee, not to make rules stricter, but to ensure they serve this community's genuine needs rather than arbitrary standards. The room remained silent as Patricia continued. And I'd like to propose an immediate amendment to the bylaws, a special exemption for snow structures built by children with no permits or prior approval required. A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the audience. Mrs. Takahashi began to applaud, followed gradually by others. Not everyone joined in, Patricia noted. Trust would take longer to rebuild than one speech could accomplish. As she returned to her seat, Sarah caught her eye with a smile and thumbs up. Richard announced that with Patricia's withdrawal, Sarah Chen would assume the role of HOA president by default, but the community should still vote on Patricia's proposed snow structure amendment. The amendment passed unanimously. After the meeting, as people gathered in small groups to chat, Patricia found herself approached by Dave Thompson. That was unexpected, he said, but impressive. Change is hard, Patricia replied, but necessary sometimes. The bylaw committee meets Thursdays at 7. We welcome your expertise, though fair warning, we're much less formal than you might prefer. Mark usually brings beer. Patricia smiled. I'll bring wine and cookies. My daughter's sending me her recipe. Apparently, I've been making them wrong for years. Outside the community center, a light snow had begun to fall. Patricia tilted her face up, watching the flakes swirl against the darkening sky. Her phone buzzed with a message from Clarissa. How did it go?